As you may recall, it was April Fool's Day that ushered us into this season of Easter, the weeks following Easter Sunday, when we read the stories of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances and we reckon with the difficult-to-believe reality of resurrection, an idea that flies in the face of everything we know to be true about being human. During these weeks of the Easter season, we're grappling with experiences that try our ability to believe in resurrection, new life, by replaying old narratives that can fool us into life-defeating realities. Doubt and fear were the first two we tackled. Today, the past. Unlike the last 2 weeks, however, today's assigned scripture is not a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. Instead, as you may have guessed, hearing the passages today, this Sunday is often called Good Shepherd Sunday. It's a day when our scripture talks a lot about sheep. Our gospel message appears in the Gospel of John just as the political tension was getting high and Jesus was feeling the pressure of the message he was preaching. But this happened before his torture, crucifixion, and death. So why is this passage assigned for today? Honestly, I have no idea. Which, in a way, makes it an exciting challenge for us. What does Jesus talking about sheep have to do with us trying to figure out how to get our minds around resurrection? Well, humor me here, but I think this passage might have a message for us about the past. By that I mean that you and I have had experiences that sear themselves onto our realities and teach us what human life is like. And this body of knowledge, of course, helps us navigate a treacherous world because we know how things work and we know the results of certain choices and we know what to expect. But resurrection changes everything. Knowing Jesus changes everything. And when we learn this new reality of life, as informed by the gospel message, where we're called to live in the world following a law of love, well, the old ways of doing things just aren't true anymore. We are invited into a new reality altogether. The problem is that we've heard the old stories too many times. They rise to the surface when we're afraid or unsure. And all too often we look at the future through the lens of the pain we have seen and experienced, fooled into thinking that the narrative of the past is the only script that we have as we face the future. Jesus lived in an agrarian society, as you know, filled with farmers and fishers and shepherds. So Jesus must have quickly concluded that a good way to make his point that day was to use a metaphor that his neighbors would find easy and familiar. We, however, are less likely in our day-to-day subway commutes to run into a flock of sheep. So here's a little background. Remember what your mom always said? If you see your friends jumping off a cliff, would you follow? Well, if you're a sheep, the answer would be yes. Sheep are just not that smart. They have to be watched carefully because they can easily be sidetracked. They will wander off into a remote part of the pasture, following an interesting insect. They will come to the stream and they'll feel the water on their feet and they'll bend down to drink, and if they're not careful, they'll just tumble right into the stream, get stuck. And if one sheep starts a stampede, all of the others will follow, not bothering to look where they're going, and they will follow each other into a ravine or even, yes, off a cliff. That makes the work of a good shepherd critically important. The sheep depend on the voice and the care of the shepherd, the one who watches over them as they graze, who protects them from harm, who leads them towards safety as the sun begins to sink beyond the horizon every night. When Jesus described a shepherd who fell down on the job, who didn't pay enough attention or care very much for the sheep, who saw danger coming and ran away instead of staying to guard his flock, well, the people in the crowd looked at each other and they nodded with grim familiarity. That kind of behavior, far too common. And it put not just the sheep in jeopardy, but the entire society that depended on the work of the shepherd for food and for financial sustainability. So by contrast, Jesus told the crowd he was a good shepherd. And becoming part of his flock meant he would never let his followers down. In fact, he told them he would go so far as to sacrifice his very life to show them the way of love, lived out in real time, right in front of them. And maybe that's why the passage of Jesus talking about the Good Shepherd comes to us this fourth week of Eastertide. Post-resurrection, you and I are being asked to believe something that is not part of our general experience of being human. The pain of our pasts, all of us, includes story after story of people we trusted letting us down, of actions and messages that tell us we are unworthy, of leaders casting hopeful vision and then leaving when the going gets tough, of death as a final, irreversible loss. This is just our experience. It's our human reality. Why would we ever try to imagine a future that looks different? But Jesus is here asking those who are listening and asking us to try to believe in a future that could be different, a future in which he will not leave us, a future in which love is the power that can change the world, a future in which the painful experiences of our pasts do not have to be our future reality. He's the Good Shepherd, and he wants to help us write a different, hopeful future. Whew, that's hard. Trying to live a life with an expectation of a changed narrative of the future. We're so used to the past, to the pain that has defined us. We can easily be led astray by the many voices we hear in our lives, voices bound and determined to convince you and me that this world is going to hell in a handbasket, and that there is no hope to be had here, and that war and devastation and hunger and pain is really all there is for us. And it makes sense that we would listen, because very often this is our experience. There is a lot of pain in this world. What if pain is the only thing we can truly expect for our future? And what about the experiences of the past, that radio messages like, "What are you thinking? Your perspective is completely invalid. You don't have anything to offer." They might even say harsher things like, "You're worth nothing. You deserve to be mistreated. Unhappiness is just your lot in life." Friends, these echoes of the past can sometimes be loud and uncompromising, and hearing them makes our ears perk up. Based on our experiences, these voices strangely begin to make sense. Let's be honest. We're often unable or unwilling to imagine and to live into a future that is different from our past. But hear what Jesus says today. "I am the Good Shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep." The experiences of our past might fool us into thinking that the only shepherd we will ever find is a shepherd who runs away when things get tough, or worse than that, is defeated by the evil all around us. But Jesus wants us to know that following him means enjoying the care of a good shepherd, one who has tenderly nurtured us all our lives long, who will reconstruct the disappointment and pain of our pasts by helping us write a hopeful narrative for the future. I had the distinct pleasure of traveling this week to Boston to pay a visit to Eleanor Fosdick Downs. Those of you who know the history of this church might know that Eleanor is the oldest daughter of the very first pastor of this church, Harry Emerson Fosdick. Do the math, and you'll quickly realize Fuzzy, as she's been known since high school, is now 106 years old. She's sharp as a tack. She's a graduate of Johns Hopkins Medical School, a retired pediatrician who was a doctor long before it was common to find women in the role of physicians. So she was quick to bring up the fact that this was a banner week for women in the city of Boston. Not only did Desiree Linden become the first American woman to win the Boston Marathon in 33 years, we talked at great length about the woman who came in last. It took Mary Shirtenlieb more than 13 hours, which, to be fair, is far less than it would take me, to finish the Boston Marathon. Shirtenlieb ran Monday's marathon, her first ever, to raise money for the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, a medical center where she is a patient. Shirtenlieb was diagnosed with leukemia in 2013, living a medical nightmare that included 2 relapses and a stem cell transplant. In 5 years of ill health, Mary endured hopelessness and pain. She watched her body steadily diminish. She frequently grappled with her mortality. Mary decided to run the marathon to paint a different picture for the future, to tell a story of renewed health and beautiful strength and robust tenacity. So she started training in September of last year and began the marathon on Monday with high hopes. The problem was that temperatures in Boston that day hovered around 30 degrees, with pouring rain soaking all of the runners. Around mile 15, Mary was shivering with cold. Her lips were blue. Her body was so tired. She ran into a medical tent where she was advised, "It's time for you to catch the shuttle back to the base." It infuriated me, she said, because I trained so hard for this. And I've gone through so many tougher things, she said. They were like, "It looks like you have the beginning signs of hypothermia, and if you stay out there, you could get really sick." Certainly finally admitted to herself that she was risking her health to continue, but her husband, Rich, had an idea. He suggested he take her home, get her a warm shower, some warmer clothes, and then they would go back to the race at about 8 p.m. when the wind and the rain were forecast to stop. So after a quick dinner with her children, the couple returned to the same place they'd left the race hours earlier and made their way to the finish line in the dark. Against the odds, Mary Shirtenlieb crossed the finish line of the Boston Marathon at 12:18 a.m. on Tuesday morning. "I never thought I would be this happy being in last place," she said. Imagine a body diminished by a deadly disease on the brink of death several times. For Mary Shirtenlieb, this was her reality, but it was not the future that she dreamed for herself. And so she literally stepped out in faith to embrace a new reality for the future, refusing to be fooled into thinking that her past was the only story her life could ever tell. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. That was the past. But what is the future? Long before Jesus walked on this earth, there was a man named David who knew that the voice of God was really the only compelling voice in all of our human experience. And of all people, David should have known. He was, after all, the one who followed voices of temptation, greed, and lust, and got himself in a whole heap of trouble. But he was also the one who one night sat down with his harp and began to think of his former life as a shepherd. All those days and nights that he had camped out on the hills right outside of Jerusalem, sling tucked in his belt, staff clutched to his side, surveying his flock at rest. And as David sat on his throne, harp in hand, all the distracting voices of international strife, of power-hungry advisors, of needy people were ringing in his ears. This was the soundtrack of his life. And David thought about those feelings, and perhaps he began to think that the only voice that led him out of his own pain and confusion toward a hopeful future was the voice of the Good Shepherd. And so David picked up his harp, needing to hear that clear voice steadying him towards something different, toward a hopeful future. David plucked the strings of his harp and began to sing these beloved and familiar words, which you are welcome to say with me. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now that is a hopeful future. Don't let yourself be fooled by the past. Whatever the pain of your past, it does not have to be the story of your future. There is a good shepherd, a resurrected shepherd, inviting us to write a different future for ourselves and for our world. The only question today for us is whether or not we will have the courage to step out in faith and follow. Amen.